When Kobe Bryant found Thomas Reed sleeping against the exterior wall of the Staples Center on a January morning in 2009, he had been walking alone from the parking structure to the arena entrance, the way he sometimes did in those early hours before the city fully woke up. Thomas was 61 years old, a veteran of 2 tours in Vietnam, and he was sleeping under a flattened cardboard box with a duffel bag for a pillow and a Lakers blanket someone had given him, pulled up to his chin. The irony of that blanket would not occur to Kobe until later. What struck him in the moment was something else. The man's boots, which were military issue, worn down to almost nothing, but polished. The man had no home and no bed, but he had polished his boots, and something about that small, precise act of dignity stopped Kobe completely. The question was never whether Thomas Reed deserved better than a cardboard box. Outside an arena, he had served a country that had given him very little in return. The question was what you do when you find a man like that at 6 in the morning with a practice to get to and a whole day already mapped out. Nobody, not Kobe, not Thomas, not the security guard who had been pretending not to see the old veteran every morning for 2 weeks, could have predicted what that January morning was going to set in motion. Kobe had come in early that day. Not unusual. He was 30 years old and in the middle of what would become his 4th championship season. And he was the kind of man who treated January practices with the same urgency he brought to playoff games, which is to say, completely and without reservation. He had parked in the structure and taken the long way around to the entrance. The way he did when he wanted a few minutes of cold air and quiet. Before the day began, the morning was gray and the plaza around the Staples Center was empty, or nearly so. He saw the blanket first, the purple and gold, then the boots, then the man's face. When Thomas stirred at the sound of Kobe's footsteps and looked up with the particular alertness of someone who has learned to wake up quickly because the world does not always wait politely to disturb you. Thomas looked at Kobe without recognition for a moment. Then recognition arrived slowly. The way it does when you are 61 and have just been woken from a cold sleep, and the face you are looking at belongs in a television, not on a January plaza at 6 in the morning. He started to sit up, and Kobe said, "Take your time," and crouched down to his level. Thomas looked at him steadily for a moment. "You're the basketball player," he said, his voice rough from the cold. "And the morning." "I am," Kobe said. Thomas nodded, as if this confirmed something he already suspected, but had not entirely believed been watching you play. "Since you were a kid," he said. Kobe looked at the cardboard and the duffel bag and the polished boots. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. Thomas considered this 3 weeks here, he said. "Before that, I was up near MacArthur Park. Couple months before that." He shrugged the shrug of a man who has stopped counting. Kobe looked at the blanket Lakers fan. He said. Thomas glanced down at it. "Somebody gave it to me," he said. "I didn't ask for it, but I'm not in a position to be particular about blankets." Kobe almost smiled. "What's your name?" he asked. "Thomas Reed," the man said, and he straightened slightly when he said it. The automatic straightening of a man who had spent years being asked his name in a context where how you said it mattered. "You serve, Thomas?" asked 2 tours. Kobe said Vietnam. Kobe was quiet for a moment. "Do you have family here?" he asked. Thomas looked out at the empty plaza. "A daughter," he said in Riverside, "haven't talked in a while." Kobe sat down on the cold concrete beside him, which was not something he had planned to do. and which would mean his warm-up pants needed to go directly to the laundry, but which felt like the only appropriate thing to do in that moment. He sat and Thomas looked at him with an expression that had several things in it: surprise and a careful kind of dignity that was deciding whether to accept this. They talked for 40 minutes. Thomas told him about Vietnam in the specific way veterans sometimes do. Not the broad strokes that make it into speeches, but the small particular things, the smell of the air in the mornings, and the sound a specific kind of bird made, and the name of a man in his unit from Memphis, Tennessee, who had been funny in the way that people are funny when they are afraid, and who had not come home. Thomas talked about coming back to a country that had not known what to do with him, and about the years that followed, which were not all bad. He said some of them were good. There had been work, and there had been a wife, and there had been his daughter Angela, who had her mother's eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness, and who had grown up before Thomas entirely understood that was happening. And then Thomas said, the years that were not good in the same plain, factual voice he used for everything. And Kobe listened, the way he listened to coaches, when there was something important being said, which was completely and without interrupting. Before he went inside, Kobe asked Thomas if he would be willing to talk to someone from the foundation. That afternoon, Thomas said he didn't need charity, and Kobe said, I know. And Thomas said, I mean it. I'm not a charity case, and Kobe said, I understand that, and I'm not offering charity. I'm asking if you'll talk to someone. And Thomas was quiet, and then he said, all right. Kobe's foundation director met Thomas at a coffee shop near the arena that afternoon. She had done this kind of work before, and she understood that Thomas Reed was not a man who needed to be handled. He needed to be talked to, like a person. And she did that for 2 hours, over 2 cups of coffee. That Thomas drank slowly, the way people do when they are making something. Last, she called Kobe after she said, he's going to be difficult. And Kobe said, I know. And she said he has real pride. And Kobe said, I noticed the boots. And she said, right, exactly the boots. So we have to do this carefully. And Kobe said, I trust you to figure out what carefully looks like. What carefully looked like was this: a room in a transitional veterans housing facility in Koreatown that had a window and a proper bed and a bathroom down the hall, and a resident coordinator named Marcus, who had also served and who understood without being told what it meant to be asked to accept help from a stranger. Thomas moved in 11 days later. He had argued about it for 9 of those 11 days. His daughter Angela drove up from Riverside when she heard and stood in the hallway of the facility with her hands over her mouth, and Thomas looked at her from the doorway of his room and said, "Don't make a fuss." And Angela said, "I'm not making a fuss, Dad." And Thomas said, "It looks like a fuss." And Angela said, "That's just my face." And Thomas made a sound that was almost a laugh. Kobe did not attend the move-in. He had asked his director to handle it, because he understood that Thomas Reed was not a man who would want an audience. For the moment his life changed, and because some things that you set in motion are better left to complete themselves without you standing there expecting to be thanked. He heard about Angela from his director, and he sat with that. For a while he thought about what Thomas had said about her, the daughter in Riverside who had her mother's eyes, and her grandfather's stubbornness, and who Thomas had not talked to in a while, and what a while means when a man is sleeping outside an arena in January. And a while means something closer to years than months. And he thought about the specific courage it takes to say yes to a room in a facility in Koreatown, when what you want to say is, I can take care of myself. Because the person you have been your entire life is someone who takes care of himself. And that person does not accept rooms in facilities. The foundation connected Thomas with a veteran services coordinator named Patricia, who helped him access benefits he had been eligible for years, but had never filed for, because the paperwork was designed for people who had an address and a phone, and an afternoon to sit at a table and fill things out. Thomas had a room now and a phone that Patricia helped him get, and Patricia sat with him at a table. 2 afternoons a week until the paperwork was done. Angela drove up from Riverside. Every other Sunday, she brought food, and they watched whatever game was on, and Thomas told her things he had not told her before, and Angela listened and did not say, I wish you had told me sooner, because she understood that he was telling her now. And now was what they had, and what they had was enough. Kobe heard about the Sunday visits from his director, who heard about them from Patricia, who heard about them from Marcus, the resident coordinator, who noticed that Thomas came back from those afternoons walking slightly differently, not lighter, exactly, but more settled the way people walk, when something they have been carrying has been acknowledged. 5 months after moving in, Thomas walked to the Staples Center on a Tuesday afternoon. He had a ticket that Kobe's director had arranged in the lower bowl, 15 rows from the floor. He wore his good jacket and his boots, which were still polished, and he sat in his seat and watched Kobe Bryant play basketball from close enough to see his face when the ball went in. And Thomas watched with the focused attention of a man who had spent 2 months watching from a cold plaza and understood the difference between watching from outside and being inside. And watching after the game, a security guard came to his seat and said, Sir. And Thomas stood up, and the guard led him through a corridor and through a door. And Kobe was there in a hallway. Outside the locker room, still in his uniform, his hair damp, and Thomas looked at him, and Kobe said, Good to see you, Thomas. And Thomas looked at him for a moment and said, You too, son. And the word came out naturally, the way words do when they have been waiting to be said. And both men understood it, and neither of them made anything more of it than it was. They shook hands, and Thomas walked back out through the arena to the street and took the bus back to Koreatown. And Marcus was at the desk when he came in and said, How was it? And Thomas said, Good, and went to his room and sat in the chair by the window that faced west and watched the last of the evening light leave the sky. The room in Koreatown had a small desk beside the window, and Thomas started using it within a few weeks. At first, just to keep track of things, his appointments with Patricia, the days Angela was coming up from Riverside, the schedule of games he wanted to watch. But gradually, for other things too, he had a notebook from the supply room downstairs, and he started writing in it. Not because anyone had suggested it, but because the room was quiet, and the desk was there, and some of the things that had been living in him for 50 years had started to feel like they needed somewhere to go. Besides inside, Marcus noticed the notebook and said, Are you a writer? And Thomas said no. And Marcus said, Okay. And Thomas said, I'm just writing some things down. And Marcus said, That counts, and went back to what he was doing, which was the right thing to do. Patricia mentioned the notebook to the Veteran Services Organization she worked with, and the organization had a program, a writing group that met on Thursday evenings in a community room 2 blocks from the facility. Veterans writing about their service, about what came after, about the years that were good and the years that were not. Thomas went once to see what it was, and came back the following Thursday and the Thursday after that. Angela read some of what he wrote. He showed her one evening when she drove up from Riverside, and she sat on the edge of the bed in his room and read for a long time. And Thomas stood by the window looking at the street below. And when she finished, she said, "Dad." And he said, "It's just some things I wrote down." And she said, "I know." And she held the notebook for another moment before she handed it back. Kobe found out about the writing group through his director, who had heard from Patricia, who had heard from Marcus, and he called his director and said, "Make sure they have what they need for that program." And his director said, "Already done." And Kobe said, "Good." And that was the end of that conversation, because neither of them needed to say more. A year after the morning, on the plaza, Thomas Reed was photographed for a Veterans Advocacy newsletter, standing outside the Koreatown facility in his good jacket and his boots, which were still polished. And when the photographer asked him to say something about what had changed, he thought about it for a long time, the way he thought about things that mattered. And then he said, "I had the same boots the whole time. I just needed somewhere to stand." And the photographer wrote it down. And Thomas looked at the words afterward and thought that was about right. That was about exactly right. Kobe saw the newsletter on his director's desk and read the quote and set it back down and went on with his day. But he thought about it that evening, sitting in the quiet of his house after everyone else was asleep. He thought about boots and the specific dignity of a man who polishes them when he has nothing else. And he thought about what it means when someone who has carried something alone for 50 years finds a room with a desk and a window and a notebook, and a Thursday evening group of people who understand without being told what he has been carrying, and slowly over time begins to put it down. The writing group met every Thursday evening in a room that had folding chairs arranged in a circle, and a coffee maker that worked most of the time, and a facilitator named Donna who had been running the group for 4 years, and who had learned to let the silences exist without filling them, because sometimes the silence after a veteran said something true was part of what needed to happen. Thomas read aloud from his notebook for the first time on his 5th Thursday. He had brought the notebook every week before that, but had not read from it. And on the 5th Thursday, he opened it to a page near the middle and read 12 sentences about a morning in 1968, and what the light looked like, and the name of the man from Memphis, Tennessee. And when he finished, the room was quiet for a moment, and then Donna said, "Thank you, Thomas." And the man across the circle who had done 2 tours in Iraq nodded once, and Thomas closed the notebook and put it in his jacket pocket. And that was enough. That was more than enough. The foundation continued to support the writing group for 3 years after Thomas first walked through its doors, funding the room and the coffee and Donna's time, and occasionally the printing costs when the group decided to publish a small collection of their writing in a staple-bound booklet that they called What We Carried. Thomas had 2 pieces in it. He did not show Angela the booklet for 2 months after it came out, and then one Sunday he took it from the desk drawer and set it on the table between them without saying anything. And Angela picked it up and opened it, and found his name in the table of contents, and looked up at her father. And Thomas was looking out the window the way he did when he did not want to watch someone's face. Do what faces do. And Angela read both pieces and sat for a long time afterward. And then she said, "Dad," and Thomas said, "I know." And she said, "No, you don't." And he said, "All right, tell me." And she said, "You're a good writer." And Thomas said, "I'm just writing some things down." And Angela said, "I know," she said, "that's what good writing is." If this story moved you, drop your city and country in the comments below. And if you believe that the people who served deserve to be seen, please hit that like button and subscribe. Click the video on your screen right now for another story that will stay with you.